One of the biggest stories from Cornwall this week has been confirmation that there almost certainly will never be a large sports stadium built to the west of Truro. This is something which has been talked about for at least 12 years. The stadium was going to provide seating for about 10,000 spectators. There have been petitions and protests demanding that it be built. And there are now many people who are disappointed that it won't be. It's instructive to look at the history. At first, it was going to provide an exciting new home for the Cornish Pirates Rugby Club. The Pirates are an entirely private enterprise based in Penzance, and despite their undoubted qualities, it has to be said that their on-pitch heroics are not quite as exciting to people who live 70 miles away in Bude, Launceston or Saltash. But the stadium at Truro wasn't going to cost the residents of Cornwall anything at all, provided that Cornwall Council granted planning permission for a huge housing estate and an Asda supermarket. In 2011, one of the leading campaigners for the stadium was Cornwall Council's own chief executive, but it wasn't long before he was asking councillors to fund the project with local taxpayers' money. The following year, a suggestion that the council should find between 12 and 16 million pounds for the stadium led to the resignation of the deputy leader of the leading Conservative group of councillors. As political manoeuvres go, this didn't do him any harm. 3 years later, he was elected to Parliament in his home constituency of North Cornwall, and he's now a government whip. But for the next few years, nothing very much happened. The property developers who had options on the land didn't need to do anything. The value of their investment increased dramatically simply by watching the grass grow. In 2015, in one of the more dramatic of several political interventions, the then Prime Minister David Cameron told people that if they voted Conservative in the coming general election, he would consider getting central government to pay for the stadium. This promise was, he said, conditional upon there being a credible business case. Now, you might think that having a credible business case was a pretty important detail. I'll come back to the business case in a moment. The following year, with Cornwall's Conservatives safely re-elected in every constituency, Asda decided that the days of large edge-of-town supermarkets were probably behind us. With no supermarket to pay for the stadium, Cornwall Council itself decided to embark on a hugely ambitious scheme to take over the whole project, housing and all, in an attempt to finally get bulldozers onto the site. In 2018, the council paid for and published what was described as a comprehensive business case, and it certainly showed how building a stadium would be a piece of cake. But when it came to what you would actually do with a stadium, then the crystal ball became a bit more opaque. One idea was that it should also provide a home for Truro City Football Club, also privately owned but virtually penniless, having been rescued from administration a few years earlier. To justify using public money for the stadium, there had to be some sort of public benefit. The council's business plan used the word health no fewer than 42 times and talked about making 50,000 people in Cornwall more active in only 2 years. Now that's nearly 10% of the whole population, and the detail of how they were going to become more active was never fully explained. Eating pasties and drinking beer while watching a game of rugby probably doesn't count as being more active. The council's business plan also never really explained how 2,000 rugby fans and only a few hundred football fans were going to make the revenue case for a stadium designed to hold 10,000 spectators. Sport England was going to be asked to chip in, but Sport England's idea of community benefit meant having a sports facility which the community could actually use. This meant the provision of multi-sports games areas and somewhere for local youngsters to exercise. The rugby club didn't like this, and it wasn't long before the business plan had to consider a future without Sport England. In 2019, the Pirates Rugby Club bought the struggling Truro City Football Club, whose own ground was about to be sold and turned into a supermarket. Truro's footballers have spent the past few years having to play their home matches in Plymouth. If this carries on much longer, they won't even be allowed to call themselves Truro and still play in the same league. By 2020, the projected costs of the stadium had increased to £22 million, more than double the original forecast. On the 5th of May this year, the council surprised almost everyone when it announced it was going back to the government to ask for money to build the stadium. This was going to come from Michael Gove's Levelling Up Fund. 2 weeks later, the council changed its mind. It's still not clear what happened with the council, MPs and stadium promoters all now blaming each other. What is clear is that if there ever was a bid to the Levelling Up Fund, the business case was no more credible than the one which the government has been rejecting since at least 2018. The blame game is now well underway, and this is a story which still has legs. But for the property developers, the story already has a happy ending. The housing estate got its planning permission. 3,500 homes on some of the most valuable farmland in Cornwall. But whether any of those homes will be affordable for local people depends on your definition of affordable. Certainly none will be what's called social housing, which means that none of the 22,500 people on Cornwall's home choice waiting list will be any closer to getting somewhere to live. And as Truro's footballers consider how they might ever return to their home city, they are also considering if they might have to use jumpers for goalposts. Goodbye.